Welcome to podcast number 6 of Bass Talk with Hagen and Heyes. Today's topic is the Czech Bass School. So, Susan Hagen, tell me about the Czech Bass School.
Well, David Hayes, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. And you?
I'm doing well, thank you. I have to say that the Czech Bass School is bigger, more important, more influential than anything I had realized until a few years ago. And I think for me, part of that is because, and I know we talked about this briefly in an earlier podcast, I didn't know that Franz Samandel was really František Samandel was Czech. I thought he was Austrian because he was a member of the Vienna Philharmonic and taught at the Vienna Conservatory. So until I realized that he was also Czech, and I started to realize that Rabier was Czech, and Czerny I knew of, but had not learned a lot about him, realized that he was Czech, and then all of a sudden I was talking to you one day and I said, wow, all of these guys are from Czechoslovakia. This is amazing. I find it just mind blowing. And before I turn it over to you, I want to tell you one quick kind of cute story. When I was in high school, I went with my youth orchestra. We went on a couple of tours of Europe, and one of them brought us to Prague, the only time I've been to Prague. And I'm saying this because I know you've been so many times, and you were there when it was a communist country, and I was there right after all communism had fallen in that region of the world. We went to Germany 2 years after. We were supposed to go the year the Berlin Wall came down, but they paused that idea just for safety reasons. But in that tour, we also went to Prague, and we played in the Dvorak Hall, and I walked into these places, and it's the strangest thing because I'm backfilling information, but I remember feeling like this was a place that was very double bass centric, and I didn't know why, but I just felt like this heavy importance of bass. And now now I know why. And it was the weirdest thing because I said to my friends, I feel like this is very important for us as bass players to be here, but I'm not understanding why, and I wasn't smart enough to go home and research it at the time. But tell the listeners about your experiences in Prague and all of these amazing composers that exist too.
Well, my interest began when I was at school with Simandl Method for Bass. It's the only book we had at school, so that was my introduction to Czech. And then when I went to study the Royal College of Music, I played, I think, the first sonata by Mízek. So suddenly I was starting to learn a little bit about this. And I've always been fascinated by repertoire. So I was always in the library, which had a fantastic collection of music. And I went through every box and looking at all the different repertoire. And then I tried to buy copies of things which were available. And then I saw an article by Rodney Slatford in one of the ISB magazines. And he'd been to Prague and Bratislava, the Czech and Slovak capitals. And the article was fantastic. It was talking about the Czech Bass School and how most of the playing we do today emanates from the Czech Bass School. And at the bottom of the article, it said, it said about the music publishing is state-run, non-profit making. And if you write to these addresses, they'll probably send you free music and recordings. So I wrote to Prague and Bratislava, the music information centers there. And the first one back was from Prague. And I had a big pile of Czech music, bass music, and a record. And that was František Pošta, the Grančina bass of František Pošta.
So that's how
And
you got that album.
it is. And I put the record on it. I met Sarah, my wife, just before that. And I put the record on. And within a minute, she said, he's the one. He's the one you to study with. And she could recognize the singing quality that I wanted to do, which I couldn't do, but he could. And then from his records, I saw all these different Czech composers. And there was Czerny and there was Kukinka. I think Maštalíž was another one. And the more I researched it, the more I started to understand how important the Czech school was for all of us. And I researched quite a lot because this is my passion, is the history of the bass and the repertoire and the composers.
Right.
And I discovered that it all links back to the Prague Conservatoire, which was the bass class was founded in 1811 by Václav Hauser. and everything emanates from there. And from there, from Hauser, he went to Joseph Rabier, and eventually Simandl, who went to Vienna. And Simandl was really the key figure because he was the one who taught all the great players who then went to every other capital city and exported the Czech school. And I've loved researching this, and I've really enjoyed finding these manuscripts by Kukinka and Tulacek and the old editions of Czerny's music and bringing them back into print for new generations. And I absolutely love it.
And I think you found some music also by Karl Trauch, who studied with, if I'm right, Hauser and Rabier, right?
Yes, that was a name I knew, but his name was Karoly Trausch. Well, Karoly
Ah,
is, I think, Hungarian.
okay.
So I started doing a little bit more research, and then I met David Spisak in Hungary, just on the internet, and
Hmm.
he's been researching Trausch, and I didn't know Trausch was Czech. That was so
Right.
funny. His name was Karol, which is a Czech
Yes.
name, Karol Trausch, and he'd written a lot of bass music, but because he was in Budapest, all his manuscripts were there, and I
Ah,
think he wrote a method for bass, lots of bass pieces which are still unpublished, and I think he was a key figure in Hungary for the development of the double bass there. So
so
that
yet
that was
another
fascinating.
person. It's another person. This is, I think, the amazing thing. So many of these players slash composers slash teachers from the Czech school they went everywhere in Europe and kind of spread the good word of double bass, as it were.
But what was nice about the Czech school is, and certainly when I studied with Pochta, is there was a system.
Yes.
And it tied in very much with how I'd worked out very early on that most string players end up in orchestras.
Hmm.
But violin, violoncello, they've joined an orchestra having played all the concertos, sonatas, unaccompanied works. And bass players, I always thought we had a different approach where you only got so far and technically, and you only needed one or two solo pieces for your auditions. And that was because you were only ever going to play in half and first position most of the time.
Right.
Which, but I always thought that if you could play in the higher registers, you could certainly play in the lower registers.
Hmm.
And I just thought we shouldn't be any different to violin, viola, cello. And if you studied all the great solo repertoire and the chamber music, it would make you into a greater orchestral player.
Sure.
And I've been right because
Yeah.
all the players today, almost all the great players, have played as soloists, played in chamber music. They teach as well,
Yeah.
most of them, and we're now no different to violin, viola, and cello. And I think that's really healthy. And that's what I was introduced to in Prague with František Pošta. And he gave me copies of technical studies by Czerny, which were long out of print, but he still had a few copies. The I think 30 caprices by Czerny, and it was fantastic just to be introduced to all this repertoire. And Poshta owned Czerny's bass, which is this famous Grancino bass. And
Wow.
sometimes I would have lessons on this Grancino bass, and I'd be playing Czerny's music on Czerny's bass, and it's so amazing. And Poshta was also is much shorter than me, and the end pin was fixed because you didn't need an adjustable end pin because he was the only one person who played it. So I was
Right.
taller than him. So I had to balance this priceless bass on a book of piano music, books of piano music,
Oh,
and
wow.
I had to keep it upright to keep the balance because if I moved it ever so slightly,
Oh,
all the
the
books would
music would
move.
slip.
And I got this priceless bass, and I couldn't move. It was so
No
strange.
pressure.
No, it was unbelievable. But Posture was amazing because he could pick up any bass, like Gary Carr.
Yeah.
And you just know it's Gary Carr because it's Gary Carr. And Posture was the same. He
Right,
just had
right.
this ability to turn any bass into a Posture bass.
It's amazing because you were there, in a time when it was really hard to get into that country too. You were there, you were studying, and so you are yet another person who has, on a deeper level. I grew up with Samandel new method for double
Mm.
bass. I still to this day love it. I think it's really effective and it's works really well. It's a great fingering system and all that. But you were involved in it deeper because you worked one on one with Poshta and you went to Prague to do it.
It's interesting how Rodney Slatford was the one who'd written the article about the Czech Slovak bass school.
Yeah.
And then he'd organized the Isle of Man competition. And I went to the second one in 1982. And Poshta was on the jury and gave a recital. So I was able to meet Poshta. And he said, come and study with me. And that was 1982. But I wasn't good enough to get a scholarship. So Sarah and I had to fund it. And it took me 4 years to actually do anything about it. It was also the Czechoslovakia was still communist rule at that time,
Right.
which made everything was much more difficult. If you go on a holiday, you go through the National Tourist Board, they do everything for you. If you go as a private citizen, you have to do everything. So we had to book our flights. We couldn't get a visa until a week before we flew. There's no guarantee you got a visa. So we queued up at the Czech embassy in London, and it was only something like $10, but we wrote a check. They don't accept checks. You have to pay in cash. We didn't have any cash. So we had to go back the next day. So we were one day closer to flying. We still hadn't got our visas. Then we got to Prague, and then we had to change currency from sterling into Czech crowns. And we had to change something like £10 a day. We were there, I think, 12 days. So it was £120. But we just couldn't get rid of the money because a journey on the tram was 2 pence. So 50 journeys for £1. It was amazing, really. And we couldn't bring the money back out. That was the rule, is they kept the sterling. And then we also had to sign in with the police because we were there privately. And we had to go, and I remember Poshta took us to, and fortunately his English was really good, so he was able to sort it out for us. Good. But it was really strange, and we were told not to take photographs near things and just be careful. And it was a very strange time, but I wouldn't have changed anything because it was still a vibrant city, even in 1986. It's just it wasn't open to Europe.
Right. Yeah. It's amazing. And I keep trying to think about the timeline of all of these composers. Like Trouch was a little older than Simandl. Simandl and Dvorak were about the same age. They were born within a year of each other. And then Czerny was 20 years or so younger than the two, Simandl and Dvorak.
And many of them had studied composition with Dvorak.
It's amazing. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense because you've made a lot of this music available through the recital music publications between Chimes Music and Jason Heath's Double Bass headquarters. And these are pieces I'd never even heard of, composers I'd never even heard of. And each piece that I look at, I'm like, oh, this is beautiful. And it makes so much sense because they worked with Dvorak, so they had some really great, I think, compositional training.
I've enjoyed this journey because I've been finding, and Poshta was interested in Czech music particularly. So he was the one who helped me with the manuscripts of Czerny. And Czerny was born in a little village called Nové Středecí. And every 2 years, Poshta used to go and do a recital there of some cooking his music and other things as well. And it's fascinating because most of this music is out of print or never been published. So I have copies of the manuscripts, and I've had them for many years. But it's only now I'm really getting on top of these things. And music of Tulecek, I met Rudolf Tulecek's, I think it was great nephew or something like that, who was a Czech violinist. And suddenly I then had all copies of all these manuscripts of pieces he wrote, which I'd never heard of him. And I'm really enjoying bringing these things back to life. And I think it's important for the younger generations to know where we've come from and how we've reached where we are. And one thing that Poshta always said to me is always remember the people who've gone before you, because everybody's made a contribution, however big or small. Everyone has made a contribution, and I always thought that was a nice thing to do. So if there's an anniversary, I'm the first one there. It gives me another reason to organize a concert or a workshop or a commission project or something. And I really enjoyed that.
I think that's great. I remember when I first started teaching at Boston Conservatory, a student came in and played the Mishek Second Sonata. And I thought, what a beautiful piece. Who's this Mishek guy? I've never heard of him. And I'll tell you that in Boston, for sure, I don't know about the rest of the country here. Mishek, Czerny, Trouch, None of these people are music that we've even heard much of. And I remember saying to this student's teacher, "Where did you find this Meshach piece?" And he said, "Oh, my teacher taught it to me, and he had, a very, very fine, very well-known teacher." And he said, "But he was of Czech descent, so he knew about it." And I said, "Oh my God, there we go." And I had a kid in a youth orchestra that was a student, and he came and he played a small piece by Czerny. And I'd never heard of Czerny. I said, "How do you know this piece?" And he said, "Oh, well, my teacher is a descendant of Oscar Zimmerman, and so he knew about it." And I said, "Oh my goodness." But the pieces haven't been widely published or made available here. I mean, as you were saying, things were out of print and possibly not distributed, I'm going to guess, because of sort of what we used to refer to as being behind the Iron Curtain.
That was one of the issues. There was a lot of music I didn't know about. So when I went to Prague, I was able to get copies or push to provide me with copies. And the Czerny music, I think the Mazurka and Chant d'Amour, I think he gave me copies. And then I discovered that they were published by, I don't know if Weinberger, I can't remember who it was now. Oh, Bosworth, that was it. And they were in Vienna and London. And at the time, Bosworth still had a small office in London. So I went to see them, and I said, "Can I get hold of archive copies?" And it took months to get. It was unbelievable. It's like going to Mars and back. It's all they were doing was contacting Vienna, ask them to photocopy it, send it back to London. That's all it was. It was so funny. But I got copies of all these pieces by Czerny, all these original editions. But a lot of music doesn't stay in print because bass music doesn't sell in vast quantities. It's not like piano music or violin music. Right. So it'll be in print. I don't know, they might print 1,000 copies, which might take 20 years to sell.
Right.
In which case, they're not going to print another 1,000.
Yeah.
Because all your money is tied up with music which is sitting on the shelves, which is the nice thing about the downloads now. Because it just makes everything accessible to everybody.
Yes.
And it just means my publications, Recital Music, is now available to every country in the world, just with a click of a mouse. It's really amazing how things have changed. Because in the past, people had to buy the music and then had to put in an envelope and post it. Sometimes the customs problems. There were always lots of reasons. Whereas nowadays, it's great. And things like IMSLP is fantastic, just for learning a little bit more about these composers and their repertoire. And I discovered that Czerny had written 4 concertos. I had one of them. The first concerto is still in print in a very strange edition, but the other 3 aren't. And so it's on my list to have new editions of all these pieces, possibly both tunings for solo and orchestral tuning, because that's going to be another podcast, solo and orchestral tuning.
Yes.
That is another issue altogether.
Oh, it is.
But again, the nice thing about downloads is I can put both tunings in one edition with no extra cost to anybody. Because the one thing I know as a teacher is if you tell your students to buy the orchestral tuning version, the first opportunity they ever have, the rest of the program is in solo tuning. You just know. Whereas if they're both there, you've got them, it doesn't matter when you play them or who with, because you've got both piano parts.
It's so much better. When I was in college, things here in America would usually come with either solo tuning piano parts or orchestral tuning, and you could usually choose. And so we always would choose the orchestral if it was an option, but sometimes it wasn't. And I was lucky. I mean, it was always expensive to buy that other piano part. It was always just enough out of the budget that my whole recital would have to be really rethought. I remember wanting to play the Schulhof Concertino, but everything else was in solo tuning. And then it's like, oh gosh, what do I do? I was lucked out because one of my teachers was a beta tester for the program Sibelius, and they were working on scanning in piano parts and recognizing them and then being able to transpose them. And so he said to me, I need to do this work anyway. Why don't I take your piano parts for your concertos and all of your sonatas and stuff, and I will transcribe them, and then we'll check and see, because Sibelius Company needs to know if this works or not. And I was so grateful because I couldn't afford to buy all those other parts, or maybe I could afford it, just it felt like I couldn't. I think I probably would have had to have borrowed money from my parents, which is just something I didn't want to have to do. But it was, that solo and orchestral tuning. This is one of the things I love about the downloads. I've got them. I've got them both, and it doesn't cost the people, the publishers, any more money because you're not printing them. And I have them on my laptop, and I print off what I need when I need, or I just use it on my iPad. Now I have a question about Rabier.
Yes.
He was Czech.
Yes. He was a second bass teacher at
Okay,
the
I was
Prague
gonna say he's
Conservatoire.
kind of like the granddad of all of this.
Yeah, I think he was, because I think he wrote, I think Hauser wrote studies as well, but
Hmm.
I think maybe Rabier was more important. And what was interesting in those days is nothing was printed. So
Mm.
Rabier would have had a set of studies in hand copied, and he would have given that to the student and saying, make your own copy.
Haha,
So you
yes.
would had so you would in fact you would have known the piece almost intimately before you've even uh, picked up your
Right.
bass.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I think that's why there's a book of studies by God, who Stork Rabier.
Yes, those are
Well,
very popular here.
Stork studied with Rabier. So I wonder whether these are Rabier studies, which were discovered in Stork's library after he died. Without,
I
but so suddenly Stork is attached to these studies when they might not even be his.
That was going to be my next question. It's like you
Mm.
read my mind. I've worked a little bit out of that book, but I've taught quite a few students that came to me having already started that book, so we would still kind of work in it a bit. And I've always wondered who wrote them.
It could well be. There's also, I have music by Joseph Abert, who was again a Czech bass player, composer, ended up in Germany, and in his collection there are lots of hand copied studies, again with no attribution. It doesn't say who they're by,
Hmm.
but he studied, I think, with Rabier as well. So I wonder whether they're his studies, but this is just Abert's copy of the studies.
Right, right.
So, and I think at this point we probably never know, because if it's anything like Bottesini's manuscripts, there's no date on them, there's no composer name, there's no librettist name. You have no idea who wrote these
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
It's
Oh,
interesting.
it's interesting, but regardless of who actually wrote them,
Mm.
we're pretty certain they came from the Czech school, and somehow either Rabier or one of his students wrote them, so they're going to have that same kind of schooling attached to them,
And there's
which
still fantastic technique.
they are. They
It
are.
hasn't changed in 150 years. There's still really fantastic technique. And it's, if you're going to play in an orchestra, this is the area you want to be playing in. and I
Right.
and they're as musical as you want them to be. It's like, I think it's like any study. If you decide it's boring study, that's entirely up to you. But I think that's your job as a musician. And
Always.
I tell my students, it's always you. Our job is to turn lead into gold, because we're
Hmm.
not given gold every day.
Right.
We are given lead sometimes, and it's our job to hide the fact that it's lead.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think as bass players, especially, people have this feeling of, well, Brahms didn't write for us
mm,
soloistically. Beethoven didn't. Yes, they wrote orchestral parts for us, but you're not going to ever have a sonata or a concerto by them. Um, and we have people that no one's heard of. And I say, but that doesn't mean they're not great,
we
And
have we yeah. I think what's interesting is we have lots of player composers, but every other instrument does as well. The cello has lots of these player composers, but the cello also has Elgar and
yeah.
Dvorak and
Hmm.
Schubert, and that was the difference. We didn't get
Right.
those. So
Right.
a lot of our repertoire has been player composers. And I think a lot of it's been lost because music goes out of print. But
Yeah.
I've enjoyed bringing the Kukinka music back into print, and Poshta enjoyed playing these little miniatures by Kukinka. And I had a copy of his concerto. I've had it for, wow, 30 years.
Hmm.
And a friend in Slovakia, Philip Jarrow, emailed me and he said, I've been looking for this concerto. Do you want to know anything about it? Yeah, I've got a copy. And he's so shocked. And then when I looked at the copy of the manuscript, I think it was finished. The composition was finished in 1921, and I thought this was. We were in 2021 at the time, and I thought, wow, this is an omen. It's a century. So right, so I now I need to do it because I have all these things I'm going to do, and I always have a list. And often I don't do that list, but I do another list, which I haven't made a list. I've always got 50 things I'm working on. And that was suddenly a reason to finish the concerto. And then he recorded it, which was nice. And he's performed it, which is great. And I like the fact that it's music which is linked back to the Czech school, but also is linked back to Dvorak in some way. Right. These composers on the whole weren't as great as Dvorak, but they must have picked something up from him.
I love that. I'm sure that, I know in some of the music that I've taught and played, you can hear those sort of the Czech sound and influences. And I always feel like, oh, that must be from Dvorak, But I think it's great. You've got the books of miniatures, books 1, 2, and 3. They all have some of these Czech composers we're talking about today. And the Heritage book, I know, has a piece by Trauch. And it's nice because what I like about what you've done is you've taken them, you've written them out, printed them, typeset them, they look great, and sprinkled them into other things. Because I don't know if any of us would say, oh, I want a whole book by composers I've never heard of from the Czech school. Maybe not. And then you don't purchase it. But if you have a collection of a bunch of different composers and there's some Czech school sprinkled in there, it's great. And then we're getting access to it. And I love teaching them to my students and explaining the heritage. I think the heritage for bass players is really important. And it's interesting because now around the time of Simandl, it had to have been around the time of Bottesini, right?
Yes.
So you've got this.
Bottesini died 1889, and Simandl died in was it 1912?
1912, I think. Yeah.
Around, yeah. So
they're kind of overlapping a bit, and you've got these amazing things happening in different parts of the world for the double bass. And Bottesini, we're going to do a whole podcast talking about him. We already have. It's great. I could talk about Bottesini for days. He was so influential. I think he was the big splash. And then you had sort of in baseball what I would call your scrappy little everyday players, in that we've got a bunch of maybe lesser known for multiple different reasons, but composers and players from the Czech school, but really such a strong, solid foundation for so many of us in the land of double bass.
I've enjoyed putting the different books together. The miniatures is quite nice.
Yes.
Because that could be anything. And book 3 has more transcription than I planned, but that's just how it happened. It's nice. And the Heritage series, again, is on the whole shorter pieces. But the Heritage series is bass composers who are maybe not Czech, because the Czech ones I'm putting into the Bohemian bass series. But there can be a crossover. It really doesn't matter. It's just there are so many, I think, so many great composers, so many great pieces, which are still worth teaching and learning and performing today. Yeah. And I think by having a miniatures book 3, Heritage series, Bohemian bass, hopefully that is more appealing, as you say, than a book of music by Simandl.
Right. Multiple composers, I think, is interesting, and I don't know, something I would want to purchase. Oh, heck, it's something I do purchase regularly. I love a collection because I have different styles of music at my fingertips. They all have some common thread, which is why they've made it into the collection together, but it makes it a lot of fun. And I love that, you still have more plans for making these Czech composers.
I'm working on Bohemian Bass Book 2 at the moment.
Oh, wonderful.
These things always take a long time because I'm working on other things as well. And this is nice because it's a Dumka by Gregora, who was another sort of Czech bass player composer. And this was in a Simandl series from 1903, I think. It's really nice little piece. And then I've got a fantastic Dumka by Kukinka, and that's never been published. So, and again, I had the manuscript for a long time, so that's going to be in there. I've got a nice little piece by Tulacek called Introduction to a Suite. It's a really nice, it's a lovely little piece, very charming, very elegant. Nice. and then I've got, I think, a Vegan Lead by Lasker, which ties in nicely with you, which Kuzovitsky recorded.
Nice.
That was in the 1920s, and then probably one other small piece as well. And then you've suddenly got five different composers.
Yeah.
And hopefully it's interesting enough to, as I say, to be able to play and teach and perform.
Right.
I think I think it's important that this music is given a new lease of life. I always call it giving kiss of what's it called? Kiss of life to all these things.
Oh,
And
yeah.
if it's meant to survive, it will do. And if
Right.
not, it'll fall by the wayside as things always have.
Well, without having it easily accessible, it doesn't have a chance. And you're giving it that opportunity for us to know the pieces and give them an opportunity. And I now Dumka, it's does that mean thought? Is that what the name is? What the word
It is.
means?
I thought it was Czech because there's the Dumky Trio by Dvořák.
Right.
But when I was writing my own Dumka, I checked, and it's a Ukrainian dance, meaning thought. I think
Ah.
it's quite slow and quite reflective. And there's
Okay.
a Dumka by Czerny, which I played. Again, it's
Hmm.
quite slow and relaxed. And yeah, I wrote the Dumka in the
The
Hertel
Harold
series,
remembered. Yes, that's what made me
which one
think
of your
of.
students played. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that was nice. I enjoyed. I enjoy learning things. I enjoy. There's so much you don't know, and it doesn't matter how much you know. There's always so much more still to learn,
Oh yeah.
and I think it's part of being a teacher. It's the learning process. I
And
enjoy that.
I love that, you look on a map to see where the Czech Republic is.
Mm,
There are so many changing borders, changing countries, shared
mm.
borders. Unfortunately, right now, border wars. Those have happened so many places, and I think though Dumka being a shared word, because in that region of the world there are just so many places. I have a friend who said to me, he said, "I'm Polish or Russian." Or Ukrainian. Well, it just depends on the year because we were from this one town and it has belonged to so many different countries. That sort of a situation, and I think the language is that way. But I think Prague being the heart of it all for double bass for so long, it's very exciting and it makes me want to go back there. And
It's nice. We haven't been back. Last time we were there was December 2019,
mm,
just before the pandemic, and then we're going back in December this year, first time in four
that's
years. But we've been
so
going since
nice.
1986, so I've probably been 40 times, maybe more.
Yeah,
Really,
that's
it's a
amazing.
country I love more than anywhere. Really,
Yeah.
it's such a beautiful place. And what's nice is we've kept in contact with Poshta's daughter Yitka, and we always meet for lunch. And we meet in a lovely restaurant on the outskirts of Prague where nobody speaks English because only Czech people go there.
Right.
All the menus are in Czech, but now you got Google Translate on your phone,
Right.
so
It makes it
it's
easier.
so fantastic. There was something we went last time we went, and we were there early, so Sarah was going through the menu, and it came out as Moravian sparrow. What's Moravian sparrow? And it was some kind of meat. It wasn't a bird at all. It was just called Moravian sparrow for some reason. It was so strange, but it was beautiful, beautiful meal, and the people are so hospitable. And I've just got happy
Yes.
memories of playing
Yeah.
and teaching. We played. I played at the Prague Conservatoire in 2014. That would have been
Nice.
Posh's 95th birthday.
Oh, sure.
And I went out. Jerzy Valenta, who's ex-Posher student, played in the Czech Phil. He organised for me to go there, and I organised for him to come to England, and we did some Poshta celebrations to remember him and play Czech music. And what was so nice is I played a piece by Czerny, and Jerzy said there were lots of Czech bass players in the audience, and so many of them said I sounded more Czech than he did, which which was very strange.
Well, being so close with Poshta, I can see how that would happen because you really studied with him intensely.
It, it, he gave me everything I needed. We went through things very, very quickly. He was quite a tough teacher, although the Tefo Hautaho, a great friend, he'd studied there
Yes.
20 years earlier. He said by the time I knew Poshta, he'd mellowed quite a lot.
This is what people say about the
But he was
tough teachers.
yeah, he was late 60s. And and I think, yeah, in his late 60s, he was lovely. He was very, very generous, and he would take me into Prague to meet people. I used to get drunk all the time because we used to change trams, and he would always say, "I know a little bar here." So I'd go and have a little beer, and then we changed trams again, and he'd say, "I know a little bar here." And I go, so whenever we turned up to meet these important people, I was always drunk.
Oh no.
Happy memories.
The dangers of travel.
Exactly.
But it's great because I feel like you have helped bring all of this world of double bass from Prague to the rest of us. And some of us didn't even know the influences, and some of us did, and now we're learning more music of composers that, because it just was not widespread, now you're able to share the music with all of us, and it's
I've
really
really
exciting.
enjoyed doing it, and it's part of my passion is promoting the bass repertoire, which is why I commission so many pieces.
Yeah.
But I love where we come from. I love the fact that all this repertoire exists, and if it takes me a couple of hours, that's just a couple of hours out of my life. That's okay. I can do that. And it just remembers Laska and Geisel and Tulecek and Kukinka and Chen, and they gave a lot to the bass world, and I think
Yeah.
we can do the same. And if bass players don't like it, that's okay. They don't have to like it, but some will.
Can always move on to the next piece and to the next composer, but at least it's there for us to know about, which is wonderful.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, this is great. This is another great chat. I love it. And I want to thank everyone for listening to Bass Talk with Hagen and Hayes. Like and subscribe on our page and to our podcasts. And thank you to our sponsors. We look forward to talking to you all again soon.
Bye.
Bye bye.